Long before the first Spartan warrior ever hoisted a bronze-tipped spear, the fertile valleys of southern Greece told a vastly different story. The Peloponnese, that hand-shaped peninsula dangling from mainland Greece like ripened fruit ready to fall, was home to one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations. The Bronze Age Peloponnese bore no resemblance to the harsh, militaristic landscape we associate with Sparta. Instead, it flourished under the Mycenaeans, those palace-building, linear be-riding ancestors of classical Greece who dominated from roughly 1600 to 1100 BC. Their world thrived on elaborate ceremonies, extensive trade networks, and monumental architecture that still captures our breath today. In the heart of what would become Spartan territory, the Mycenaeans constructed the city of Amyclae. This was no primitive hilltop fortress. Amyclae was a proper Bronze Age metropolis, complete with a massive palace complex, sophisticated drainage systems, and workshops producing everything from bronze weapons to delicate ivory carvings. Archaeological evidence reveals that Amyclae controlled much of the Eurotas River Valley, that crucial waterway that would later become the lifeline of Spartan power. The Mycenaean world was interconnected in ways that wouldn't resurface for centuries. Merchants from Amyclae traded with Egypt, importing gold, ivory, and exotic goods that adorned their palaces. They brought tin from as far as Britain to mix with local copper, creating the bronze that gave this era its name. Their scribes maintained meticulous records in Linear B, documenting everything from tax receipts to religious ceremonies. But this Bronze Age paradise harbored a fatal flaw. It was incredibly fragile. The entire Mycenaean system depended on complex administrative networks centered around palace complexes. Remove the palace, and the whole system collapsed like a house of cards. Around 1200 BC, that's exactly what happened. The collapse of Bronze Age civilization wasn't a single cataclysmic event. It was more like watching an avalanche in slow motion. Archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities were abandoned, trade networks disintegrated, and the art of writing itself vanished in many regions. Historians still debate the exact causes, but the results were undeniable. The sophisticated world of the Mycenaeans simply evaporated. Some scholars blame invasions by mysterious sea peoples who swept across the Mediterranean like a Bronze Age hurricane. Others point to internal rebellions, climate catastrophes, or economic collapse. The truth was probably a lethal combination of all these factors, a perfect storm that toppled civilization itself. In the Eurotas Valley, the great palace of Amyclae was abandoned sometime around 1100 BC. The sophisticated drainage systems clogged with debris. The workshops fell silent. The scribes who had recorded the daily business of a thriving city laid down their styluses for the last time. Within a generation, the art of reading and writing had vanished from the Greek world. This wasn't merely a political upheaval, it was a civilizational reset button. Greece's population plummeted dramatically. The survivors scattered into small, isolated communities that struggled just to maintain the basics of agriculture and defense. International trade, which had connected Greece to the wider Mediterranean world, ground to a halt. Bronze, that wonder metal of the ancient world, became so scarce that people hoarded broken tools and weapons, hoping to reforge them into something useful. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of profound loss. Where Mycenaean sites show evidence of elaborate feasts with hundreds of participants, Dark Age settlements struggled to feed a few dozen people. Where Bronze Age craftsmen had created intricate jewelry and decorated weapons, their successors made simple, functional pottery that prioritized utility over beauty. But human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures. Slowly, painfully, the survivors began to rebuild. In the Eurotas Valley, small communities of farmers and herders established themselves among the ruins of Mycenaean greatness. They weren't trying to recreate the past, they were simply trying to survive. These early Dark Age settlements bore no resemblance to the palace complexes that had come before. Instead of massive stone buildings, people lived in simple huts made of mud brick and thatch. Instead of specialized craftsmen producing luxury goods, every family had to be self-sufficient, making their own tools, weapons, and pottery. Instead of elaborate religious ceremonies in grand temples, worship took place at simple outdoor altars. The population was minuscule compared to Bronze Age levels. Where Mycenaean Amyclae might have housed thousands of people, the Dark Age settlements in the Eurotas Valley probably contained only a few hundred souls scattered across multiple small villages. These communities were isolated not just from the wider world, but often from each other. A journey that would take a few hours today could be a dangerous multi-day expedition in the Dark Age Peloponnese. Yet even in these humble beginnings, we can glimpse the seeds of what would become Spartan culture. Dark Age communities in the Eurotas Valley faced constant threats, raiders, wild animals, and the simple struggle to grow enough food to survive. This meant every able-bodied man had to be ready to fight at a moment's notice. Unlike the specialized military classes of the Bronze Age, Dark Age warriors were farmer soldiers who grabbed their spears when danger threatened and returned to their fields when the crisis passed. The archaeological evidence shows that these early communities were remarkably egalitarian compared to what came before. Bronze Age society had been rigidly hierarchical, with palace elites controlling vast resources while ordinary people lived in relative poverty. But Dark Age settlements show much less inequality. Everyone lived in similar simple houses, ate similar simple food, and used similar simple tools. This wasn't because these people were naturally democratic, it was because they were too poor and too few to support elaborate social hierarchies. When your entire community consists of a few dozen families struggling to survive, you can't afford to have half of them doing nothing but administration and ceremony. Everyone had to contribute, and everyone had to be ready to fight. The oral traditions that would later shape Greek culture began to take form during these dark centuries. Without writing, communities had to preserve their history, laws, and religious beliefs through the spoken word. Professional bards wandered from settlement to settlement, carrying news and entertaining audiences with stories of heroic deeds and divine interventions. These weren't just entertainment, they were the cultural DNA of Dark Age Greece. Through epic poems and heroic tales, communities maintained connections to their Bronze Age past while adapting those memories to their present reality. The warriors of these stories weren't palace-dwelling bureaucrats, but tough, self-reliant fighters who earned their status through personal courage and military skill. Religion, too, adapted to the new reality. Instead of the elaborate state ceremonies of the Bronze Age, Dark Age Greeks developed a more personal, immediate relationship with their gods. Local deities associated with specific places, springs, groves, hilltops, became increasingly important. These weren't distant cosmic forces, but neighbors who could be bargained with, pleased with simple offerings, and called upon in times of crisis. The Eurotas Valley communities developed their own local variants of these broader Greek cultural patterns. They honored Hyacinthus, a local deity associated with the changing seasons and the agricultural cycle that was so crucial to their survival. They told stories of heroes who had defended the valley against invasion and disaster. They developed customs and traditions that would eventually influence the rigid social structure of classical Sparta. As the centuries passed, these small settlements gradually grew larger and more sophisticated. Agricultural techniques improved, allowing communities to support slightly larger populations. Trade began to revive on a small scale, with communities exchanging surplus goods for materials they couldn't produce locally. The quality of pottery and metalwork slowly increased as specialized craftsmen emerged within the larger settlements. By around 900 BCE, the Eurotas Valley contained several significant settlements, each controlling its own territory and maintaining its own traditions. These weren't yet cities in the classical sense. They were more like large villages surrounded by farmland and pasture. But they represented a crucial step in the recovery from Bronze Age collapse. The largest of these settlements was developing near the site of ancient Amyclae, taking advantage of the same geographical features that had made the Bronze Age city successful. The Eurotas River provided fresh water and fertile soil for agriculture. The surrounding hills offered defensive positions and grazing land for livestock. The location provided easy access to both the mountainous interior of the Peloponnese and the coastal regions that were slowly reconnecting with the wider Mediterranean world. But this gradual recovery was about to be disrupted by a new wave of migration that would transform the Eurotas Valley forever. From the north, new groups of Greek speakers were moving into the Peloponnese, bringing with them different customs, different technologies, and different ideas about how society should be organized. These newcomers called themselves Dorians, and they were about to change everything. The Dorian migration wasn't a single dramatic conquest, but rather a gradual process of infiltration, intermarriage, and cultural mixing that played out over several generations. Some communities welcomed the newcomers, seeing them as potential allies against raiders and rival settlements. Others resisted, leading to conflicts that would echo through Spartan history for centuries to come. What made the Dorians different wasn't just their northern origins, it was their approach to social organization. While the existing valley communities had developed relatively egalitarian structures out of necessity, the Dorians brought with them more rigid hierarchical concepts that had survived from the Bronze Age collapse in different forms. The Dorians didn't see themselves as refugees or migrants. They saw themselves as conquerors with a divine right to the lands they occupied. Their oral traditions spoke of Heracles, the great hero whose descendants had been cheated out of their rightful inheritance in the Peloponnese. They weren't invading foreign territory. They were reclaiming what the gods had promised them. This ideological framework would prove crucial in shaping what became Spartan society. Unlike other Greek communities that gradually assimilated newcomers through intermarriage and cultural mixing, the Dorians in the Eurotas Valley maintained sharp distinctions between themselves and the people they conquered. This wasn't just ethnic prejudice. It was a conscious political strategy designed to maintain control over a potentially hostile population. The conquest itself unfolded over several generations. Archaeological evidence suggests that some existing settlements were destroyed during this period, while others show signs of gradual cultural change as Dorian influence grew. The process was messy, violent, and uneven, with different communities experiencing different fates depending on their location, their willingness to resist, and their strategic value to the newcomers. The Dorians were particularly interested in controlling the most fertile agricultural land and the strategic high points that commanded views of the valley. They established fortified settlements on hilltops from which they could monitor and control the movements of the existing population. These weren't just military outposts, they were the nuclei of a new kind of social organization that would eventually evolve into the classical Spartan state. One of the most significant Dorian innovations was their approach to land ownership. Instead of the relatively egalitarian land-sharing practices that had developed during the Dark Age, the Dorians implemented a system based on conquest and inheritance. The best land went to the warrior families who had participated in the conquest, while the existing population was relegated to less desirable territory or forced to work land they no longer owned. This created an immediate problem. How do you maintain control over a population that outnumbers you and has good reason to resent your presence? The Dorian solution was elegantly brutal. They created a social system based on permanent military readiness and systematic intimidation. The conquered populations were divided into different categories based on their perceived threat level and economic value. The most potentially dangerous groups, particularly the populations of Messenia, that fertile region to the west of the Eurotas Valley, were reduced to helotage, a form of state slavery that was more systematic and oppressive than anything else in the Greek world. Helots weren't property in the way that chattel slaves were in other societies. They couldn't be bought or sold individually, and they maintained some connection to their ancestral lands. But they had no political rights, no freedom of movement, and were subject to annual declarations of war by the Spartan state that made killing them legally permissible. The helot system was designed to solve several problems simultaneously. It provided the agricultural labor force necessary to support a warrior class that spent most of its time training for war instead of working the land. It generated the economic surplus needed to support sophisticated military equipment and training programs. And it created a permanent enemy within Spartan territory, ensuring that the warrior class could never afford to let their guard down or abandon their military readiness. Between the Dorian conquerors and the helot slaves, the new social system included an intermediate group called the Perioeci, literally, those who live around. These were free communities that maintained local autonomy in exchange for providing military service and manufactured goods to the Spartan state. Some Perioeci were descendants of the original valley communities that had negotiated favorable terms during the conquest. Others were Dorian groups that had arrived too late to claim full membership in the conquering elite. The Perioeci occupied a crucial middle position in the emerging Spartan system. They weren't full citizens with political rights, but they weren't slaves either. They could own property, engage in trade, and practice crafts that were forbidden to full Spartans. This intermediate status made them natural allies of the Spartan state, since their privileged position depended on maintaining the system that kept the Helots subordinate. At the top of this social pyramid sat the Spartiates, the full citizens who claimed descent from the original Dorian conquerors. This was a deliberately exclusive group, probably never numbering more than a few thousand adult males even at the height of Spartan power. Membership was hereditary and jealously guarded, with strict rules governing marriage, property ownership, and behavior. The creation of this three-tier social system wasn't the result of careful planning. It emerged organically from the practical problems of conquest and control. But once established, it created powerful incentives for the development of the extreme military culture that would make Sparta famous throughout the ancient world. The Spartiates couldn't afford to be part-time soldiers like the warrior farmers of other Greek cities. With a potentially rebellious Helot population outnumbering them by perhaps 10 to 1, they needed to maintain constant military readiness. This meant developing professional military skills, sophisticated training programs, and social institutions designed to produce the most effective warriors possible. Enter Lycurgus, the semi-legendary figure who supposedly gave Sparta its distinctive laws and customs. Whether Lycurgus was a real historical person or a mythical representation of collective social development remains hotly debated by historians. What's clear is that sometime during the 8th or 7th century BC, Spartan society underwent a dramatic transformation that created the classical military system. The Great Retra, Sparta's fundamental constitutional document, established the basic framework of Spartan government and society. Unlike the written constitutions of other Greek cities, the Great Retra was an oral tradition that could be modified and reinterpreted by each generation while maintaining the appearance of ancient, unchanging law. The Great Retra created a unique system of dual kingship, with two royal families sharing power and serving as checks on each other's ambitions. This wasn't just political innovation, it was a practical solution to the problem of leadership succession in a society where military effectiveness was literally a matter of life and death. With two kings, the state could survive the death or incompetence of either one without losing its military leadership. Below the kings, the Great Retra established a council of elders, the Gerousia, composed of men over 60 who had proven their worth through decades of military service. This body served as both a supreme court and a legislative council, providing institutional memory and wisdom to balance the potentially rash decisions of younger warriors. The citizen assembly, the ecclesia, included all adult male Spartiates, but its role was limited to approving or rejecting proposals made by the kings and Gerousia. This wasn't democracy in the Athenian sense, but it did ensure that major decisions had the support of the warrior class that would have to implement them on the battlefield. The Great Retra also established the fundamental principle that would define Spartan society, the complete subordination of individual interests to collective military effectiveness. Personal wealth accumulation was discouraged through sumptuary laws that prohibited luxury and ostentation. Private property in the traditional sense was limited, with the state controlling land distribution and inheritance. Most importantly, the Great Retra established the principle that Spartan children belonged to the state rather than to their families. This wasn't just symbolic, it was a practical recognition that producing effective warriors required systematic training from childhood, not the haphazard education that most Greek cities provided. The transformation of Spartan society wasn't accomplished overnight. Archaeological evidence suggests that the classical system developed gradually over several centuries, with different elements being added and refined as circumstances changed. The process was probably driven as much by practical necessity as by ideological commitment to military excellence. The constant threat of Helot rebellion meant that Spartans couldn't afford the luxury of internal political conflict that characterized other Greek cities. The system had to produce not just individual warriors, but cohesive military units capable of operating effectively under extreme stress. This required unprecedented levels of social coordination and individual discipline. The economic foundation of this system was the helot labor force that freed Spartans from the need to engage in agricultural work or craft production. Each Spartan citizen was assigned a plot of land worked by helots, providing the economic surplus necessary to support full-time military training. This wasn't just about leisure time, it was about creating the material conditions necessary for professional military excellence. The helot system also created a permanent training environment for Spartan warriors. The annual Krypteia, a secretive program in which young Spartans hunted and killed helots, wasn't just terrorism, though it certainly served that function. It was also a form of advanced military training that taught young warriors to operate independently behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, and kill efficiently under pressure. This systematic brutality toward the helots wasn't incidental to Spartan military culture, it was central to it. By normalizing violence against a dehumanized enemy population, the system prepared Spartans psychologically for the extreme violence of ancient warfare. You can't create soldiers capable of standing firm in a phalanx battle against professional enemies if they've been raised to view violence as morally problematic. The religious dimension of Spartan society reinforced these military values. The state cult centered around gods of war, victory, and death, with elaborate festivals celebrating military virtues and honoring fallen warriors. Religious ceremonies weren't separate from military training. They were integrated into a comprehensive system designed to produce warriors who viewed death in battle as the highest form of religious devotion. The transformation of the Eurotas Valley from a collection of Dark Age farming communities into this extraordinary military society represents one of the most dramatic social engineering projects in human history. Within a few centuries, the descendants of Bronze Age collapse survivors had created a state that would dominate Greek military affairs for 300 years. But this transformation came at an enormous cost. The creation of classical Sparta required the systematic enslavement of entire populations, the suppression of individual creativity and initiative, and the subordination of all human values to military effectiveness. The society that emerged was certainly efficient at producing warriors, but it was also brittle, inflexible, and ultimately unsustainable. The birth of Spartan warrior culture wasn't a gradual evolution from existing Greek traditions. It was a revolutionary break with the past that created something entirely new in human experience. The Dorian conquest had provided the initial framework, but the classical Spartan system was a conscious creation designed to solve specific problems of control and defense in a hostile environment. 7 years old, that's when childhood ended in Sparta. While other Greek children were learning to read and write, playing with toys, and enjoying their mother's affection, Spartan boys were ripped from their families and thrust into the most rigorous military training program the ancient world had ever devised. This wasn't education as we understand it, this was the systematic forging of human weapons. The word Agoge itself means leading or guidance, but these gentle terms masked a reality that was harsh beyond modern comprehension. The Agoge wasn't just about learning to fight. It was about rewiring the human psyche to prioritize collective survival over individual comfort, to view pain as weakness leaving the body, and to consider death in battle as the highest possible achievement. The process began before birth. Spartan women weren't just expected to produce children, they were expected to produce warriors. Pregnancy was treated as a form of military service, with expectant mothers following exercise regimens designed to produce strong, healthy babies. The state had a direct interest in the physical quality of each generation, and prenatal care reflected this priority. When a child was born, they didn't automatically become citizens. Instead, they were examined by a council of elders who determined their fitness for membership in Spartan society. Weak, deformed, or sickly infants were abandoned on the slopes of Mount Taygetus to die of exposure. This wasn't considered cruel. It was considered necessary quality control for a society that couldn't afford to waste resources on individuals who would never contribute to collective defense. Modern sensibilities recoil from this practice, but it's important to understand the logic behind it. Sparta existed in a constant state of siege, surrounded by enemies and sitting on top of a potentially rebellious slave population that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Every resource spent on supporting a non-warrior was a resource that couldn't be spent on military preparation. The society couldn't afford sentiment when survival was at stake. Those infants who passed inspection returned home with their families, but this reprieve was temporary. Spartan mothers were allowed to love their children, but they were never allowed to forget that those children belonged to the state. From the earliest age, Spartan children were taught that their highest loyalty was not to family, but to the collective good of their warrior society. The training that would shape these children began, informally, from the moment they could walk. Spartan homes didn't coddle children the way other Greek families did. There were no soft beds, rich foods, or protective clothing. Children slept on hard surfaces, ate simple food, and wore minimal clothing even in winter. This wasn't poverty, it was conditioning. Physical fitness was emphasized from the earliest age. While other Greek children played games for fun, Spartan children engaged in activities designed to build strength, speed, and pain tolerance. Wrestling, running, and swimming weren't recreation. They were preparation for a lifetime of military service. But the real transformation began at age 7, when boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the Agoge proper. This wasn't a school in any conventional sense. It was a comprehensive life restructuring program designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it according to Spartan military values. The boys were organized into groups called herds, a deliberately animalistic term that reflected their status as raw material to be shaped by their instructors. These groups became their new families, providing the emotional bonds and social identity that had previously come from blood relatives. The message was clear. Your loyalty belongs to your military unit, not to the people who happen to give birth to you. The physical conditions of the Agoge were deliberately harsh. Boys slept in dormitories on beds made of reeds. They had to gather themselves from the Eurotas River. They wore a single cloak year-round regardless of weather conditions. They went barefoot to toughen their feet and develop better balance and agility. Food was kept deliberately scarce, not because the state couldn't afford to feed them properly, but because hunger was considered an essential part of training. Hungry boys had to be resourceful, creative, and aggressive to survive. They were expected to steal food, and the only punishment was for getting caught, which demonstrated insufficient stealth skills rather than moral failure. This systematic undernourishment served multiple purposes. It made the boys physically tough and mentally resilient. It taught them to function effectively under extreme stress. It prepared them for the reality of military campaigns where food would often be scarce and soldiers would need to forage, raid, or go hungry. Most importantly, it reinforced the lesson that individual comfort was less important than collective strength. The educational curriculum of the Agoge was unlike anything else in the Greek world. While other cities emphasized literature, rhetoric, and philosophy, Spartan education focused on practical military skills and physical conditioning. Boys learned to read and write, but only enough to understand military orders and basic communications. Intellectual curiosity was actively discouraged as a distraction from more important pursuits. Music and dance were part of the curriculum, but these weren't arts for their own sake. They were military training tools. Spartan songs were martial compositions designed to inspire courage and solidarity. Spartan dances were weapons drills performed to rhythm. Every cultural activity was subordinated to the primary goal of producing effective warriors. The boys were taught to speak laconically, using as few words as possible to communicate essential information. This wasn't just a cultural quirk, it was a practical military skill. On the battlefield, clear, concise communication could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The famous Spartan wit that impressed other Greeks wasn't about cleverness for its own sake. It was about precision under pressure. Physical training intensified with age. Younger boys focused on basic conditioning, running, swimming, climbing, and wrestling. As they grew older, the training became more sophisticated and dangerous. They learned to use weapons, practiced formation fighting, and engaged in combat exercises that regularly resulted in serious injuries. Pain tolerance was a crucial component of training. Boys who showed fear, complained about hardship, or sought comfort were subjected to additional punishment and public humiliation. The goal wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the systematic elimination of weakness that could compromise unit effectiveness in battle. The psychological dimension of Agoge training was just as important as the physical conditioning. Boys were taught to view themselves as part of a sacred brotherhood whose mission was to protect Spartan civilization from its enemies. Individual identity was subsumed into collective purpose, creating warriors who would literally rather die than let down their comrades. This process was reinforced through elaborate initiation rituals and tests of courage. The most famous was the ordeal at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where boys were flogged until they lost consciousness or died. Those who cried out or begged for mercy were disgraced, while those who endured in silence earned honor and respect. These rituals weren't sadistic entertainment. They were practical tests of the psychological conditioning that the Agoge was designed to produce. A warrior who couldn't endure physical pain without breaking wasn't ready for the reality of ancient combat, where wounds were common and medical treatment was primitive. The social dynamics within the Agoge reinforced these military values. Older boys were given authority over younger ones, creating a hierarchy based on military virtues rather than birth or wealth. Competition was constant and fierce, but it was always framed in terms of collective benefit rather than individual achievement. Boys who excelled in training earned recognition and privileges, but they were also expected to help their weaker comrades improve. The goal wasn't to produce individual champions, but to create cohesive units where every member met minimum standards of effectiveness. A boy who achieved personal excellence while allowing his comrades to fail was considered a failure himself. The mentorship system within the Agoge reflected broader Spartan social values. Older warriors took personal interest in promising young boys, providing guidance, protection, and emotional support that replaced the family relationships that had been severed at age 7. These relationships were often intensely emotional and sometimes sexual, but they were always framed in terms of military development rather than personal pleasure. The treatment of girls in Spartan society was unique among Greek cities, reflecting the same practical military logic that shaped the Agoge for boys. While other Greek women lived in seclusion and were considered inferior to men, Spartan women received physical training, education, and social freedoms that scandalized the rest of the Greek world. This wasn't because Spartans believed in gender equality as a moral principle. It was because they understood that producing superior warriors required superior mothers. Weak, sheltered women couldn't be expected to give birth to strong children or to raise them with the toughness that Spartan society demanded. Spartan girls engaged in athletic competitions, learned to read and write, and were encouraged to develop physical strength and mental toughness. They competed in foot races, wrestling matches, and javelin throwing, often in the nude, shocking visitors from other Greek cities who were accustomed to seeing women completely covered and confined to domestic spaces. The marriage customs of Sparta reflected these same practical considerations. Marriages were arranged by the state to produce the strongest possible offspring, with physical fitness and genetic health taking precedence over family connections or personal preferences. Women typically married in their late teens or early 20s, much older than in other Greek cities, because the state wanted them to be fully mature and physically developed before beginning childbearing. The ideal of errate, excellence or virtue, permeated every aspect of Spartan education and society. But Spartan errate was defined very specifically in terms of military effectiveness and collective service. Individual talents, creative impulses, or intellectual curiosity that didn't directly contribute to military capability were not just ignored, they were actively suppressed as dangerous distractions. This created a society that was remarkably effective at its chosen purpose, but severely limited in other dimensions of human development. Spartans produced no great philosophers, poets, or artists. They built no magnificent temples or public buildings. They made no significant contributions to science, mathematics, or literature. All of their creative energy was channeled into the single goal of military excellence. The psychological cost of this system was enormous. The Agoge produced warriors who were extraordinarily effective in battle, but often struggled to function in peacetime situations. They were trained to be aggressive, decisive, and ruthless, qualities that served them well in combat but made them poorly suited for diplomacy, trade, or the normal social interactions that characterized life in other Greek cities. The boys who survived the Agoge, and not all did, emerged as young men who had been systematically stripped of individual identity and rebuilt as components in a military machine. They thought of themselves not as separate people with personal goals and desires, but as interchangeable parts in a collective organism whose sole purpose was warfare. This transformation was so complete that foreign observers often commented on the peculiar uniformity of Spartan behavior. Unlike other Greeks who displayed the full range of human personality types, Spartans seemed to have been manufactured rather than born. They moved, spoke, and acted with a coordination that impressed and unnerved observers from more individualistic societies. The Agoge represented perhaps the most systematic attempt in human history to reshape human nature according to specific social requirements. It demonstrated both the tremendous potential and the horrific costs of comprehensive social engineering. The boys who entered the system as 7-year-olds emerged as some of the most effective warriors the world had ever seen. But they had paid for this effectiveness with their individuality, creativity, and emotional range. As these products of the Agoge reached adulthood, they would take their place in Spartan society as full warriors, ready to defend their city-state against any threat. But they would also carry within them the psychological scars and limitations created by their childhood conditioning, limitations that would ultimately contribute to Sparta's decline and fall.